One of the interesting things about jiu-jitsu is that there are no universally accepted standards for what each belt means. It's a little bit subjective. There is parity among belts to some extent. In other words, a purple belt from Australia will probably find that their belt holds up pretty well against a purple belt from New York City or from Brazil. But as far as the details of what each belt means, it's up to each individual instructor based on their worldview, based on their influences, based on their lineage. So this is what I think the belts in jiu-jitsu mean, understanding that I'm heavily influenced by my instructor, Mr. Roy Dean, who was influenced by his instructor, Roy Harris, who was influenced by his instructor, Joe Moreira, who was influenced by Francisco Mansour, who was influenced by Helio Gracie. I'm 5 removed from Helio Gracie, and this is what I think the belts mean. Let's start with white belt. Probably the most underappreciated of the belts. I think the white belt is, in some ways, the most important belt. It's certainly the foundational belt. Everything you learn at white belt is critically important, and it's going to be the foundation for everything that comes next. I would go so far as to say that you will learn more at white belt than you will at any other belt. And that's a little controversial to say that, but think about everything you have to learn at white belt. You don't know anything. You have to learn the 4 major positions: mount, side control, guard, back. You have to learn those positions both defensively and offensively. You have to learn how to get out from side control. You have to learn to pass the guard. You have to learn how to escape the back. You have to learn how to escape the mount. You have to learn offensively attacks from guard. You have to learn the arm bar, the omoplata, the triangle. You have to learn collar chokes. You have to learn cross-body attacks like the Americana. You have to learn mount attacks, chokes, arm bars, triangles from the mount. You have to learn back attacks, the rear naked choke, the bow and arrow choke, maybe even some arm bars and triangles from the back. At white belt, you're also going to learn half guard to some extent. You're going to have to learn what to do defensively and offensively from half guard. You're probably going to learn some butterfly guard. You're going to learn some sweeps. You're going to learn some leg locks. That is a huge amount of information that you have to learn at white belt. It's like being a fisherman and casting your net as wide as possible. You're just trying to catch as many different kinds of fish as you possibly can. Now, at white belt, you can't go deep into the technique yet. You're just learning the broad strokes of those techniques and positions. The depth comes later. And so the reason why I say you learn more at white belt is because you're learning big new things. You're learning new concepts, you're learning new positions. Whereas as your belt gets darker, you're learning smaller and smaller things. You're learning details of those positions. You'll learn an arm bar, maybe on your first day of class as a white belt. You'll spend the rest of your jiu-jitsu journey trying to master that arm bar. At black belt, you're still trying to master the intricacies of the arm bar, looking for just little details. So white belt is a critically important belt. It is the foundation. Now, I look at the journey of jiu-jitsu technically like a pyramid. The base of the pyramid, in my opinion, is survival. Can you survive a violent attack? You might not be able to get out, but can you survive? The next level up from that is escapes. Can you escape bad positions? Once you've escaped the bad position, can you maintain a dominant position? And it's not enough to maintain a dominant position, but can you become so positionally dominant that everything your opponent does makes it harder on them? And then the tip of the iceberg is the submission. So that's usually the progression in terms of the technical execution that you need. At white belt, when you first walk in, it's all about survival. And this is a critically important part of learning jiu-jitsu. You're going to be tapped a lot, but that's immensely valuable, because in order to not get tapped, you have to learn to recognize patterns. You have to learn to recognize the attack sequences that people are invoking against you and be able to stop those things, hopefully earlier and earlier and earlier. By the time you get to black belt, you can stop attacks very, very early on. Whereas at white belt, you don't even know those attacks yet. So don't get frustrated if you're a white belt and you're getting tapped all the time. Learn from those experiences. Begin looking at the patterns. Begin looking at the attack sequences that people utilize to catch you, and then make yourself harder and harder to tap. So a big part of the journey at white belt is becoming harder to tap, and you'll make huge progress. The difference between a new white belt and a late stage white belt on the cusp of blue belt in terms of how hard they are to tap is huge. The other thing at white belt is you're probably not going to have a very effective offense. Offense comes later. Defense always comes first. Now, there are some people that find their offense early on. I've got a wrestler who just started training with us. He's a very skilled guy. I showed him an armbar on his first day of class, and he was literally hitting the armbar that night. So you find guys like that. Those are the exceptions. Most people don't find their offense very early. In fact, it's not uncommon to get frustrated at white belt. Sometimes even at blue belt, you get frustrated because your offense isn't really working all that well. But here's the thing. White belt is not about being good at submissions yet. You have to learn to defend. You have to learn to get out from disadvantaged positions. So focus your effort on that. Focus on being a good student. Focus on being a good training partner, and be a sponge. You don't need to go deep with the techniques yet. You need to learn as much as possible because you're building the foundation of the house. Blue belt is a very interesting belt. I call it the paradox belt. It's a paradox because blue belt is the easiest belt to achieve in jiu-jitsu. It takes a year of training, maybe a year and a half, maybe a couple years of training, and just about anybody who puts in the time can get a blue belt. But the blue belt can be the hardest belt to graduate from. It is one of those belts that signifies whether you have what it takes to get to black belt or not. If you can't get to purple belt, you're never going to get to black belt. And not everybody that gets their blue belt can turn that corner and become a purple belt, because there's a fundamental transformation that you have to make with your own game during your journey of blue belt. There's a huge difference between an early stage blue belt and a late stage blue belt. And not all blue belts can turn that corner in order to get to the more advanced game and become a purple belt. And we'll talk about the nature of that transformation. Now, a new blue belt is still an immature player, but a new blue belt should have a reasonably complete game, but a simple game. At blue belt, you still haven't delved deeply into the minor positions in jiu-jitsu. You should really focus on the major positions, and you should be reasonably complete in a very simplified way. Now, what is a blue belt? In my opinion, a blue belt is someone that can defend themselves pretty convincingly against someone who's bigger, stronger, and more athletic, but who is not a jiu-jitsu practitioner. So if you get attacked in a self-defense encounter, assuming there's not knives or multiple attackers or other variables, as a blue belt, you should be able to defend yourself pretty convincingly against that. And so in my mind, that's what a blue belt is. In our lineage, you have to be able to demonstrate 50 techniques, which is a lot, but it's all the foundational stuff. You have to be able to demonstrate guard passes and side mount escapes and mount escapes and attacks from guard, attacks from mount. You have to be able to show some leg locks. You have to be able to show some takedowns. And you need to be able to roll with a certain level of effectiveness. People should be able to look at you and say, that guy knows how to play jiu-jitsu. Now, you have a simple game. It's not a real elegant game yet, but make no mistake, a blue belt is a fairly skilled jiu-jitsu practitioner compared to someone who's never trained before. And so that's an early stage blue belt. Now, what happens at early stage blue belt is that there are still a lot of things you don't know. And so you're still trying to pull in as many techniques from all over the place. You're delving into the minor positions. You're still in sponge mode. You're still trying to learn as much as possible. There's also an interesting impulse at blue belt, which is to always be looking for that next technique, sometimes even sneaky techniques, because what you're looking for is a way to defeat your training partners, especially the ones you come up with, right? You're always neck and neck against somebody in class. And some days they get the best of you, some days you get the best of them. And so sometimes you're just looking for that little sneaky technique that they don't know so you can tap them. But at some point in your blue belt journey, and this is the corner that you have to turn, at some point you are going to realize that what you need is not more techniques. What you need is to go deeper into the techniques that constitute your game. The reason you can't tap your training partners is not because you need that next sneaky technique that they don't know. You need to master the details of the techniques you know so that you have the setups, the timing, the sensitivity, so that you can implement your offense in a way that is much more effective. And that's the corner that you turn. Generally, it's somewhere halfway into blue belt, 60% into blue belt. There's no exact place, but usually at some point in time, the blue belt will have an epiphany that what they need to do is begin mastering what they know. They don't need to continue to cast their net wide. Not everybody can make that transition. Some people get stuck in this mode of always looking for that next technique, and they never really can go beyond the superficial level of jiu-jitsu into the depth. So to get to purple belt, you need to go deeper so that you become much more effective. At purple belt, your transitions become much more fluid. And at purple belt, or late stage blue belt into purple belt, you will start learning to string combinations of techniques together. When you're new at jiu-jitsu, you're very one-dimensional. Everything is a single dimension attack. Or if you're in a bad position, it's one escape pattern or one explosive movement to get out. But what happens as you get close to purple belt, you realize that to get out from side control, it's much more effective if you can string multiple escape patterns together. You go one way, they react, then you get out. Or offensively, sometimes you attack for a choke because you know you want the arm bar, or you play with their balance to expose for a triangle. So you start learning to play with people's balance. You start learning to use momentum. You start learning to string combinations together. This is the late stage blue belt player as he heads into purple belt, being able to put the game together in a much more effective, connected, and elegant manner. One other thing about blue belt is that it can be a belt that takes a long time to get out of. I spent 3 years as a blue belt, and that's not uncommon. Some people spend 4 or 5 years at blue belt before they get to purple belt. And you will struggle as a blue belt. A lot of people make the point that most people quit jiu-jitsu at blue belt, and that's not really true. Most people quit jiu-jitsu at white belt, but no one cares if you quit at white belt. But by the time you get to blue belt, you've been training for a while, and it's more notable if you quit. Now, why do people quit at blue belt? A lot of times they quit at blue belt because of what we call the blue belt blues. And the blue belt blues is a real thing. The blue belt blues is when you're coming to class night in and night out, and it feels like you're waging the same battles over and over and over again. You get into a mode where it just feels like a grind. You're hitting this wall and you don't know how to get around the wall. You just keep slamming into the wall and slamming into the wall, and it can be really frustrating. You haven't figured out yet that you can go around the wall, or you can go over the wall, or you can even go under the wall. And so you have to just keep pushing through and pushing through and pushing through, because you will make a breakthrough. That's the thing. Sometimes when you are in the worst stage of the blue belt blues, that's the moment when you're on the cusp. You're on the cusp of a breakthrough. A lot of times, the reason we hit the wall in jiu-jitsu and nothing feels like it's working is because you need a detail. You need to go a little bit deeper into these things that you're doing. You need to stop using muscle and really focus on the technique. There are always technical solutions to physical problems. And at blue belt, you're running into a lot of walls because you're still trying to use too much muscle. You're being a little too one-dimensional in your attacks, and you haven't figured out yet how to go around these problems. So don't lose hope at blue belt. I went through the blue belt blues. Everybody that trains jiu-jitsu is going to go through the blue belt blues. And it's a badge of honor to get through the blue belt blues and understand that when you do, when you make that breakthrough and all of a sudden your game takes a leap, it is the most amazing feeling. So keep training. Don't give up. You'll get there. The purple belt, in my opinion, is an immature advanced player. If we can agree that jiu-jitsu is a continuum, you start on day one as a white belt knowing nothing, and you train for the next 30 years. Presumably, you'll get better and better and better and better. There is a point in that continuum where it can be said that you're an advanced player, an early stage advanced player versus someone who's been a black belt, let's say, for 20 years. The purple belt, in my view, is the gateway into the advanced game. Some people call the purple belt the mini black belt because the level of skill required to be a purple belt is greater than what it takes to get a black belt in other arts. You might get a black belt in 4 years in judo. You might get a black belt in 3 or 4 years in karate. You might get a black belt in 3 or 4 years in taekwondo. You might still be a blue belt at year 4 or year 5. It takes usually between 3 and 5 years to get a purple belt. I got my purple belt in about 4 years. I was a blue belt for 3 years. And by the time you get there, it can be said that you are an advanced player, an immature advanced player, but you are playing the game in the way that an advanced player plays the game, which is utilizing momentum and combinations and timing. Your energy expenditure goes way down at purple belt. You're able to be more effective by doing less. Your transitions are much more fluid. You're using much less energy as you transition. What took you 4 or 5 or 6 steps as a white belt and maybe 3 or 4 steps as a blue belt, at purple you can now do in a couple steps. You're much more effective. Now at purple belt, you are starting to learn to apply pressure. Now, you don't master the pressure game at purple belt, but you start to learn how to take up space, how to occupy space, or how to be light and fluid. There are 2 games in jiu-jitsu. You can play a slower pressure-based game, or you can play a light, fluid, speed or dynamic game. At purple belt, you're starting to learn to play both styles of game. Even though you don't really understand deeply how to apply pressure yet, you're starting to get glimpses into that. And so there's a lot of things that happen at purple belt, but mostly the purple belt is the belt of refinement. You're trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper. At purple belt, you throw away a lot of your game. You've learned all of this stuff. And you realize, oh, I use this, I use this, I use this, I use this. You create connections between those things that you're good at. You start mapping out a very interconnected game at purple belt so you can go from one position, one technique to another position to another technique. But you don't need a gigantic game. You realize that being effective is about having much more skill at a smaller subset of things which define your game. So refinement is probably the greatest impulse at purple belt. So what is a brown belt? Brown belt is where you really learn to apply pressure, and brown belt is the belt where you try to really balance out your game. Now, in jiu-jitsu, nobody's perfectly balanced. Even black belts are not perfectly balanced. What do I mean by that? It means that you're not going to be equally effective from every single position, both top and bottom, both defensively and offensively. At purple belt, you are still fairly unbalanced in some ways. There are things that you do incredibly well. There are other things that you don't do hardly at all. You should be competent from everywhere as a purple belt, certainly, but you're not totally balanced. So one of the things that happens at brown belt is you take a look at your game and you really start trying to balance yourself out to the extent that's possible. You'll never be 100% balanced. So let's say your top game is really good and you don't play guard a lot. At brown belt, you're going to spend a lot of time playing guard. You want to be as good at playing guard as you are on top. I remember Roy Dean telling me that he got to brown belt and his collar chokes weren't particularly good. And so he made it his goal at brown belt to really dial in his chokes. And I can tell you, as someone that's rolled with Roy a million times, his collar chokes are no joke. He will choke you out. And so that's something that he began doing at brown belt. So brown belt is the belt where you want to round yourself out. It's also the belt where you truly learn to apply pressure. Pressure is one of the defining characteristics of a brown belt. We think of pressure as something that you do from the top, and we've all felt it. Someone puts you in side control and they have immense pressure. It feels like your ribs are going to split. At brown belt, you realize that pressure is something that you can apply from everywhere. If someone puts you in side control, you're on the bottom. If you're a brown belt, you are putting them under pressure. You're making them feel uncomfortable. When you roll with a brown belt, you should be uncomfortable regardless of where that position is. They are applying pressure. The other thing that happens at brown belt a lot of times is brown belts will start teaching. That's usually the belt where you become truly the senior student in a big academy and the instructor starts relying you to take up some of the slack and to teach. And teaching is a huge part of advancing to the next level. Roy Dean calls teaching finishing school because that's where you really get into the details of technique on a deeper level, and you learn how to transmit that knowledge, and you learn all the sticky points with all the techniques you teach. When you first start teaching, let's say an arm bar, you might not know where your students are going to have trouble, but eventually you realize, oh, they have trouble elevating the hips and swiveling and getting perpendicular. So that's what we need to focus on with new students. And so those are the kinds of epiphanies you have at brown belt. You learn to apply pressure and your game gets much more balanced. The black belt. Probably the greatest impulse at black belt is the desire to simplify your game. You want to become maximally effective with minimal exertion. By the time you get to black belt, you have been to war 1,000 times. You have sparred against every conceivable opponent. You have been through all the stages, the blue belt blues. You've put it together at purple belt. You've learned to apply pressure at brown belt. And you have sparred, and you have sparred, and you have sparred. You've spent a lot of time on the mat. And when you get to black belt, you reach a level of effectiveness where you're not having to work as hard. And that can be kind of alluring. There's a temptation there because you say, wow, this is really great. I'm able to tap people and I'm able to be effective, but I'm not having to work that hard. And so that becomes a real interesting impulse. You say, well, wait a minute, let's see if I can keep extending this. Let's see if I can keep becoming more and more effective while doing less and less and less. So in my personal game, especially defensively, my goal is to do as little as possible and be able to defend myself and escape. And I spend a lot of time in defensive positions. I do that on purpose. And some nights, my only goal is to do almost nothing. Sometimes I'll even start to daydream, or I'll let my mind wander. And I do that on purpose because I want to be able to defend by doing as little as possible and make myself absolutely untappable. Or I'll set a goal. I want to be able to get out from a disadvantaged position by doing almost nothing, doing very little, and yet I can get to the top. And then when I get to the top, I'm trying to do very little. Can I build structures? Can I build positioning? Can I, put myself in a position where I'm using gravity, I'm using leverage, I'm using structures in a way that are able to lock my opponent down so that literally they can't get out, and I'm doing almost nothing. And so that's kind of the impulse that you have at black belt, trying to do more with less. And so simplification, it involves minimizing the steps, trying to round the corners. What might have taken you 12 steps as a white belt, you want to be able to do in one step. You also at black belt are trying to really perfect the treachery. You're trying to perfect how to play with people's balance to get those exposures. You're trying to get your setup so honed that you can funnel people into the places you want them to go so that you can get the tap with your preferred submissions. So simplification, I think, is a big part of being a black belt. And also putting your signature on the art. Jiu-jitsu is such a profoundly deep art with hundreds and hundreds of techniques. How I play jiu-jitsu is going to be different than how you play jiu-jitsu, how you assemble the techniques. It's like music. In music, there are only 12 notes. This is what's amazing to me. It doesn't matter whether you're playing jazz or classical or country or pop or punk or funk. You got 12 notes to work with. And so it's the assembly of those notes, the rhythm, how you put those things together that determine the style of music you're playing. And jiu-jitsu is a lot like that. How you assemble the techniques determines what style of game you play. And hopefully as a black belt, you can develop a unique style that you can then transmit to other people, and you can bring other people up in your mold. And so that's a lot of what a black belt is. So I hope that helps you understand the journey of jiu-jitsu. The challenge of jiu-jitsu is that sometimes you don't even know what it is that you need to do to get to the next level. Sometimes your instructor won't even tell you, other than you just have to keep showing up. And so it can be frustrating. Sometimes you just don't know. You just don't know where you're at in your own progression. Now, it's okay to ask your instructor. Now, I would not ask your instructor, hey, when are you going to give me that purple belt? Don't do that. But you can always go to your instructor and you can say, hey, would you mind assessing my game and let me know what it is that I'm weak in, what I'm doing well, and give me a blueprint for getting to that next level. And I'm sure they'll be happy to do that. So have those conversations, but mostly understand that a lot of the process that I just described is organic. It's going to happen naturally without you having to worry about it too much. As a blue belt, you're going to naturally turn that corner toward purple belt. As a purple belt, you're naturally going to want to go deeper and deeper into your techniques. At brown belt, you're going to naturally, organically learn to apply pressure. And at black belt, you're going to want to simplify. So just stay on the path. Don't worry about it too much. Keep training. And I'm sure you're going to find your game progresses year after year as you get as good as you can possibly get. Good training to you.